Hello everyone. I saw this article today. Somebody posted it on Facebook. It's about some supposedly new leaks about the Nintendo NX console and some of the technical details. And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of walk through these. There's 5 points and see if we can kind of figure out how feasible from an engineering point of view each of these would be. Um, the article starts off by talking about how the leak comes from this particular guy who in the past has been very good at providing trustworthy leaks, and so therefore we should trust. I have no idea if that's true or not. I've never heard of this guy before, so none of this is to. I don't want to make it sound like I'm casting doubt onto anything he's saying. Just if someone told me randomly on the street, hey, I think the NX is going to do these things, this is kind of how I would hear that message. And I think some of the things on this list are extremely plausible, and the machine will probably have. And then some just seem very oddly phrased. So, it would be interesting to walk through. I should just point out I don't have any special insider information into what goes on in Nintendo. But I do work at a large engineering firm. And so, I know how these large companies operate. And so, that helps me kind of read these kinds of leaks a little better. Before we get into these 5 points, though, somebody had asked on the Facebook comments in this, like, hey, why do companies keep this stuff so secret and why are leaks such a big deal? Why aren't they sharing more information with us? And there's really two reasons why consumer electronics companies keep things secret, or not keep them secret, but they are very kind of jealously guard the release of information. And the first of these is, of course, competition, right? Nintendo is competing very heavily against Microsoft and Sony. And I guess now against a whole slew of other Android-based gaming consoles like Apple TV, and so they can't kind of let their innovations be known before they're ready, because a competitor could simply beat them to the punch and release something new, right? So this has happened in the past a lot on different products. So obviously Nintendo wants to be sure that none of their kind of hard work appears in a way that a competitor could kind of snap it up and take the lead. So that's number one. Number two, though, is much more pragmatic. People are saying, hey, we are fans, we're the community, why can't we be included? And actually, one of the things I think people don't realize is when you are doing this kind of work right on the bleeding edge of technology, things are extremely unstable, right? Like you have ideas which you're working on today, and then 2 days from now you might discover, oh, this is a total dead end and we're never going to ship this. So it's really important that when you say as an engineer, hey, I want to do X might not happen. In fact, most ideas that you begin with at the beginning of a large multi-year project like this never make it to the end, because you're trying to, go pushing the edge of what's possible. So, and a lot of things that you try just aren't possible. So, companies guard this information carefully because they don't want to create a kind of sense of expectation and then disappointment when the thing fails. And if you follow the kind of drama around the retro VGS slash Coleco Chameleon, this is exactly the mistake those guys made, right? They kind of promised all kinds of things without being absolutely certain that they were going to happen, and then when they didn't happen, they kind of were stuck in this terrible position. Well, what do we tell customers? What do we tell the community? Do we cover it up? Do we go public with it, etc.? So, Nintendo's been doing consumer products for a very, very long time, and they understand, how to manage expectation in such a way that they keep their fans happy. So, because they're not sharing this information, you shouldn't read anything into that. That's just to make sure that they keep the kind of expectation pressure off the team and keeps them focused. Okay, so let's dig into these 5 points one by one and talk about how plausible each one is. So the first one is that it has a wireless HDMI dongle that attaches to the back of the device, and you can pull that out and plug it into any, they say, display with a normal size HDMI output, and then you will stream to that. So this is completely plausible. There is actually a standard called Miracast, M-I-R-A cast, which is the invention of the I think it's the Wi-Fi Alliance, which are the people who define the Wi-Fi standards, right? So they actually are the engineering. They're not tied to any product. They're a group of engineers that define this is what Wi-Fi looks like. These are the products. This is the right way to implement it, and so on. And so Miracast is a technology that lets you stream video, so high definition video, through Wi-Fi. And it's not super common yet, but for example, a lot of Microsoft products have this enabled. The Microsoft Surface line has this. Microsoft sells a dongle which you can actually buy, and it all sounds very similar to point one here. You buy the Microsoft dongle, plug it into any HDMI enabled TV, and you can broadcast from your Nokia phone or from your Microsoft Surface the image onto that. So it's kind of like wireless projection. Um, I went and looked at the Wi-Fi Alliance page. They've got a list of all the products that are officially being tested and enabled for Miracast, and there's nothing in there for Nintendo yet. But the NX isn't out yet, so perhaps Nintendo hasn't gone in through the complete rounds of testing for this. So I think number one is totally plausible. And actually, what I think is interesting is that it shows that Nintendo wants to do wireless, wants to cut cables as much as possible. And so this really implies to me that this thing is going to be very portable heavy. So it's not necessarily going to be a thing which you plug into your box, right? There's going to be elements of it which you can carry around. So I think that's pretty interesting. And in fact, I really wish more devices would do this, because the HDMI cable is so fat and inflexible. Would be awesome if you just don't have to deal with that at the back of your TV. And by the way, I should say, Miracast doesn't require you to do any kind of Wi-Fi setup with routers or passwords or any of that kind of stuff. It's completely peer-to-peer. You just kind of plug in your Miracast dongle to your TV. On your device, you say, connect me to that dongle, and away you go. So it's pretty cool. Okay, point number two. Allegedly, the analog controls for movement has small motors which give you full haptic feedback. And then he kind of explains what haptic feedback is. If you've used any of the old force feedback joysticks from the late 90s, basically what you've got is you've got a little rumble motor of the same kind that your cell phone has for doing the vibrate mode, and then the game can actually make that react. Right? It's the same thing that the original PlayStation, had with the rumble pack. This is so far from rocket science. This is totally plausible. I think the interesting thing here is, if the controller is really small, how do you prevent? But you've got to put the motor and the little weights and stuff in there. How do you prevent the controller from being really fat and unmanageable? So I think there'll be some cool design there. But yeah, this is totally doable. I don't see any issues with that one. Number three, it can Bluetooth sync with everything, especially smartphones. Blah blah blah. This one sounds. I mean, yeah, Bluetooth is not rocket science either. But I think we need to be careful here, because Bluetooth sync with everything, I think, is a very marketing heavy phrase. Bluetooth devices come in kind of classes. So there is a mobile phone device, there is a microphone device, there is a headset class, there is a keyboard class, and so on. So it's very likely that the NX supports some of these classes. So it might have the drivers, etc., for supporting the mobile phone class, so that it can show you your text messages on your game screen, etc. And it'll probably support Bluetooth headsets and microphones and so on. That's really not rocket science, so I don't see any problem with that. In fact, I'm kind of surprised to see it appear on this list, because it seems like just why not do that, right? It's hardly super exciting. Your car does it, right? Why wouldn't your gaming console do it? Number four is where we start to get, I think, it's very hard to understand what's going on here, to be honest. It says the closest in terms of power, in quotes, it gets is to the Xbox One. But an app idea is the Wii U is about the Wii U times 50 and the PlayStation Vita times 100 in power. The key is that all the tech is exactly the same hardware and layout as the PS4 and Xbox One, which then combine it with the OS's strong emulation functions and compiler means that any game you can run off a PlayStation 4 or Xbox One can easily run on the NX with near zero modification to the source code, especially if it runs in Android OS or Unreal Engine 4. This is allegedly why Nintendo has given out the dev kit so late, as one of the third-party devs put it. It's the easiest thing we've developed for. So this one is problematic in a number of instances. One is the measurement of this power. If you're a PC gamer, and you build your own machines, you'll know how tricky it is to measure the computing power of a modern computer, right? People like to use, for example, if you're a PC guy, you'll like to use the clock speed, like how many megahertz or gigahertz your CPU runs at. And you'll know also that it depends, right? If you're comparing Intel to Intel, then yeah, it makes sense to compare clock speeds, but you can't do it if you compare Intel to AMD, because they use different architectures. And that means that inside a single clock cycle, different things happen. So, AMD chips seem to run at lower clock rates, but they're actually comparable in terms of real computing. And then when you add GPU stuff, graphics card things to it, it gets way more complicated, because the number of, GPU cores you have and pipelines It gives you a bunch of optimizations, which, just because you have more cores doesn't mean you're going to render faster. So it's very, very kind of hard to do an apples to apples comparison of computing power like this. I think what is interesting in this point is where they say it uses the same hardware layout as the PS4 and Xbox One. There was a rumor previously flying around kind of June or July that AMD was building a custom chip for some unknown customer, and it was going to be a console chip. And of course, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you're building a custom chip for a console, it's really going to be one of three things. It's going to be either Microsoft or Sony or Nintendo, right? Um, and actually, the CPU, the AMD does this thing where they will build you a kind of semi-custom chip which will contain GPU cores and CPU cores in a thing they call an APU, which is like an accelerated programming processing unit or something. But the Xbox One and PS4 both use very similar APUs. It's a thing called an Intel x86 Jaguar, and that was built by AMD for these guys. So, the leak here is saying that it uses the same hardware layout as the PS4 and Xbox One. You could interpret that to mean that the NX will also be powered by a Jaguar chip. Um, However, it gets a little bit muddied because the original leak from AMD said that AMD was working on both an Intel x86 core-based chip and an ARM-based chip. ARM is the technology which is typically used for mobile devices because it's more power conscious than the x86 devices, right? So like your mobile phone has an ARM, and your tablets and so on. So it could go either way, but if they are saying that it gives you similar processing power to PS4 and Xbox One, then it's likely to be something like the Jaguar. Hopefully something a little bit more advanced than Jaguar, because of course it's been a few years since the Jaguar was made for PS4 and Xbox One, so Nintendo could be getting something slightly better. Um, the thing that's interesting about the Jaguar is that thing is not power friendly, right? It sucks a lot of watts. Like, that thing is beefy, but it needs electricity to drive that. So that would then go against the idea that this thing is mobile. Of course, what could be happening here is that Nintendo is getting two kinds of custom chips made. An x86 based one for a kind of mothership console device, and then the controllers following the Wii U kind of model could be very smart, and they could contain the ARM-based one. So, you take your controller on the go, which would support the Miracast thing from point one, and then the actual mothership console, which sits by your TV, has got the Jaguar cores, right? That's a model that could happen. One thing that is extremely misleading here is how they say that you can pretty much with near zero modification, take a game that would run on PS4 or Xbox One and just make it run on NX. If you have written multi-platform code, you know that this is like a pipe dream, which is almost nobody has pulled off. There are a few gaming engines which let you do something close to this. So there is the Unity engine, comes pretty close to this. Unreal Engine does a very good job of this. And then there was an old engine called Gamebryo, which is what powered. Oh my goodness, the name of the game is escaping me. It powered Fallout 3, and a modified version powered Fallout 4 and Oblivion. And that did a pretty good job, although not as great because it's pretty old, of doing multi-platform support. The way this works is basically these engines, things like Unreal Tournament 4, are basically translation layers between what the programmer wants to do and what the operating system needs to hear, right? So instead of having to learn, if you want to write for three different platforms, instead of having to learn three different ways of doing the same thing, drawing a triangle on the screen, you can express it in the way that Unreal Tournament wants to hear it, and it will take care of the translation at the bottom. And so because it acts like a translation layer by design, right? That's what they intended to do. Then they make it easier to move code across. But as you probably know, Xbox One has got very specific memory configuration, right? It's got a small chunk of extremely fast memory, which is supposed to be used by programmers for doing optimizing, particular pieces of their code. That doesn't exist in the PS4, and it probably won't exist in the NX either. So, if you want to write that accelerated code for Xbox One, that is not going to run on your, NX without modification. So I think we should read this to be, if you write for one of the platforms or one of the translation layers that understands NX, things like Unreal Engine 4, then you can expect to have a very easy compilation from one to the other. And hey, that's great news, right? Because it's not like Unreal Engine 4 is no slouch. That thing, it can put out a very good game. So that is something which developers are going to be very happy to hear. Oh, I can, publish my game for the big three platforms with, perhaps spending 5% of my time worrying about cross-platform issues as opposed to having to write the game 3 times over like you did in the 80s and 90s, right? So that's great news. But games that are exclusive releases are always going to be squeezing the most power out of a machine because the developers can, cut every single corner and take advantage of every single little switch and bell and whistle on that machine. Um, but still, hearing that Nintendo is becoming very developer friendly, that's great news because I think that's something that the company really needs to do. It needs to kind of move away from being extremely exclusive to being more kind of, open. And in fact, I think it might be interesting to see if this means we are going to start seeing, Nintendo IP Mario and Super Smash perhaps appearing on some of the other machines. I think if I were, on the board of directors of Nintendo where they are now, I would certainly be asking the engineering team to, is it possible for us to have a Mario iPhone game? Just as a kind of, get out of jail card in case the hardware division starts to suffer. So that's cool news. The other thing here, which I find interesting, is how they mention Android OS, right? Because they say it's near zero modification, especially if it runs in Android or Unreal Engine 4. Because then you go down to point 5, where they talk about the fact that they've got this operating system called Nintendo OS, which I think is a really clever name. And they say, hey, it's very powerful and it's got all these modern features. But Nintendo is trying to be very careful in showing it off for fear that it'll be mistaken as being Android. That I find extremely strange because it's very hard, well, for a couple of reasons. First reason is if you just look at a running operating system, you can't really tell what it is because 99% of the work that an operating system does is not visible to the user, right? It's doing things like managing memory, handling the drivers, taking input, looking after the networking. These are all things that are just invisible to the average user, even to the power user, because those things are hidden from users on purpose. That's the point of the OS. It makes all that hardware nonsense be super easy to use. So why would it be that Nintendo is afraid that people are going to mistake this thing for Android OS? And the only thing I can think of is the fact that Nintendo OS is based on Linux, right? Which is, again, not a surprise. Operating systems are amongst the most complicated things which people have ever designed, right? They've got millions of moving pieces. I think I saw an estimate somewhere like, not iOS, but Mac OS consists of 11 or 12 million lines of code, right? These are extremely complex things. They are built by a very small number of companies that have got this very particular skill set. And you think about a product like Microsoft Windows, they have got people working on Windows who have been working only on that for 20, 25 years. It's a expertise which is extremely specific. You can't just take someone who's been writing games their whole life and tell them, hey, go write an operating system, right? That would be a really hard shift. So what do? If you need an operating system, building yourself an operating system yourself from scratch is insane. No engineer would ever go for that. What you would do is you would say, okay, what is there that I can reuse? And the answer is Unix, right? Unix was intended for this. You can take, based on all the licenses that exist, you can take a branch of any kind of Unix you want or Linux, and then you can modify it to your needs and then release that. And that is exactly what Google did with Android, right? Android is in fact just Linux modified to run all the stuff that Google wanted to run with their hardware. So it's entirely plausible that this is what Nintendo has done. They've taken Linux, they've modified it, and then that's what's shipping. In fact, that's what Raspberry Pi and various other small players do as well. So if you're a developer and you get the SDK and you start looking through it and you see, hey, this is all Linux, one question that could come into your mind is, are these guys just using Android? And so perhaps they're concerned about that. In fact, I guess I would ask the question: why couldn't it run Android? Google is not competing with Nintendo in the gaming space. It might make sense for them to partner up. Like, I don't expect this thing to be running Windows, right? I don't think Microsoft would ever, license Windows to one of its major competitors. I mean, there was a time when Microsoft licensed Windows to other console makers, right? The Sega Dreamcast ran a version of Windows, Windows CE, but that was long before Microsoft got into the console game. Um, so, I think it's extremely likely that Nintendo is running some form of Linux, which actually is a very smart move because lots of developers know how to write Linux code. It's a very common industry standard, so it wouldn't be, it again makes, your developers be comfortable with writing code for your new system. Okay, so there's a kind of engineering take on this leak. Kind of interesting. It's fun to talk about these things. Leave a comment down below if you've got your own opinion, if you agree with me, but especially if you disagree. I'd love to get into a discussion about what you guys think about this. So until then, take care, and we'll see you for the next one.